Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening. I'm Rachel Lyons, the Archive and Cultural Heritage Director for the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation. It's nice to welcome everyone here and also those who are watching online. I'd like to just pause for a second and make sure to acknowledge my larger team, Jason Doyle with production, Kia Hatfield Robinson, our director of programs, and also our archive team, Laura Keller, who is greeting everybody, and Dolores Hooper, who's been helping me with some backup of just the small bits when you produce something like this. So I want to make sure to thank those folks. This is the 5th edition of the Allison Miner Series. It's a program of the Jazz and Heritage Archive that highlights research from work done by our fellowship program. For those who are not familiar with Allison Miner, she was a founder of Jazz Fest and the founder of the Jazz and Heritage Archive. She was deeply committed to New Orleans and Louisiana communities. Her work at Jazz Fest was dedicated to highlighting and celebrating the art and the music of our area. Her deep respect for the creators led her to establish the archive, a place where stories and accomplishments of Louisiana communities could be preserved and shared for future generations. This evening, I am also very pleased to welcome Dr. Ann Jabro to discuss her work analyzing the press clipping collection in the archive. I first met Ann in an email. It had a tone of urgency. She had just attended her first Jazz Fest, and as she said, I was gobsmacked by the experience. She had to know more. What was Jazz Fest about? Where did it come from? Oops, sorry, my papers. Who was behind it? And she needed answers. She kept asking. She asked someone who asked someone else, who eventually said that there was an archive, and she looked us up. Her application to do the analysis of the first decade of Jazz Fest stood out above all others. Her method of finding meaning to her 2014 attendance provided her answers and the foundation with new historical meaning of our early history. Ann's presentation, Creating Identity and Building Reputation, will focus on storytelling and messaging of the early Jazz Fest. I'm here to also provide a bit of historical context. In that role, I am now her warm-up act. The festival's history began in the late 60s when the Hotel Motel Association and the city were looking for a producer to start a jazz festival. The motivation was to fill hotel rooms and bring revenue to the city. George Wein, who was married to Joyce, a black woman, repeatedly declined to produce the festival due to Jim Crow laws and racist practices. However, by 1969, things were changing, and Wein incorporated the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation to be the fiduciary of the 1970 Jazz Festival. Through Newport Jazz and Folk Festivals, Wein was already acquainted with New Orleans and Louisiana. The Jazz Fest was originally a series of nighttime concerts featuring national acts presented across the city. In addition, the Louisiana Heritage Fair came to mind a bit later. The fair, as Nancy still calls it, was presented in Congo Square and was driven by the idea to give the tourists something to do during the day and also as a means to highlight more local talent. We needed some people to help, and his contacts led him to the Hogan Jazz Archive, where Allison Miner was working and Quint Davis was exploring the historical depths of their collection. Ween recruited Allison and Quint, as well as Jody Smith Simmons, who had been working at Preservation Hall, all to be their local point people. Ween and his team in New York City were producing festivals and managing tours all over the world. The majority of his team had already been working with him for decades. However, producing a festival and a fair in the South was new to them. The growth of the festival over the 1970s was remarkable, and many of the issues were distinct to their time and their place. Success led to celebration and scrutiny. Celebration of our culture and scrutiny of the financial success. And how was that financial success benefiting the community? This pressure created the condition where the foundation was forced to come into its own fruition. And by the close of the decade, the foundation had a director, full-time staff, and programming. Solving these problems created stability for future generations of growth, more challenge, and eventual future successes as well. Recent successes include this program, the Allison Miner Series, and the Fellowship Program, which brings in scholars from around the world to New Orleans. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our 2016 Fellow, Ann Jabro. Please help me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Oh, the clicker. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I have to tell you, I'm not a native, and in 2014, when I attended my first Jazz Fest, I'll be very honest, I am an academic, but before I was an academic, I was a journalist, and then I served in public relations. And any time that there's been an event, there's always been signage that tells you all about the sponsor and asks you for money everywhere you go. And I was astounded that I was at this amazing party and I really didn't know who was hosting the party, and no one was asking me for anything. So I thought, yes, I need to find out why that is. Again, it was a great party, and it just seemed logical that there should be more to this than there actually was. So I'm going to give you a little bit about the presentation, a little bit of background about myself, and a little bit about what I found. I found much more than I can share with you here, but I think what I've tried to do is capture the highlights of the years that I studied. So we're going to look a little bit about the co-creation of meaning, and why I want to start with that is because most of the articles that I reviewed were written by men. And men and women tend to see the world through different lenses. So the content of the boxes of press that I read were literally not full newspaper pages, but clippings. And so I don't have a context for what else was around those clippings. But what I did do was track who wrote the article, who was quoted in the article, what the article was. Was it news? Was it public relations? And so I'm going to define those differences for you so that you can get a sense of where did the story start and how did it actually end in the first 10 years. And I liken the story, has everyone had exposure to the story, The Little Train That Could? It was a sermon that was given in a church setting and later became a book. And what it did for young children, and it's in the top 100 books of the National Education Association, is it basically said you have to persevere, you have to trust, and you have to work hard, even when things don't look like they can be accomplished. And that's what I felt my study basically confirmed, that getting the festival off the ground and getting the foundation to have its own identity was a really difficult task. And so the co-creation of meaning is the first thing, and I just want to spend a few seconds playing some audience participation. Okay. I have 4 native food and beverages: soft-shell crab, shrimp Creole, hurricane, sweet potato pie. So could I see a show of hands, your most favorite New Orleans cuisine? How many people will go for the soft-shell crab? Okay, we had a good number there. How many people will go for the shrimp Creole? Not as many. How many people will go for the hurricane? Yeah, I thought so. And how about the sweet potato pie? No one. One, Dolores. Okay. So why do we pick different delicacies? We have a different orientation to what we call something that we really want to enjoy. I know I'm on an eternal diet, so I would always go for the beverage. It has calories too, though, right? So this model was actually developed by Dean Barlin in 1970, and what it tries to do is explain how we communicate. And in essence, the most important thing about the communication process is somehow having co-creation of meaning. So that what I say, what's your favorite treat, and what you respond are similar. But as we know, in most instances, we don't have co-creation of meaning, and we don't take the time to find out, even if we are in any way near the same idea. So co-creation of meaning, and going back to a male perspective in the journalistic story, can at times impact how a story is told and what the value of the story is. We begin to see 2 to 3 females covering stories, and interestingly, in the Figaro and the Times-Picayune, they began to do investigative reporting about festival in the later years. And so in the initial years, we see a lot of press releases and event announcements and talent, but we don't really see any type of news. And then as it becomes more successful, we see more conflict and we see more journalism actually being reported. So the 60s and the 70s, I always like to start at the beginning, and the reason is, as a teacher, I often say things and realize my students didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And so I want to contextualize the 60s and the 70s because that's when festival is being born, if you will, and growing. This is a great quote from a woman who attended the 1979 Jazz and Heritage Festival. And she says, "New Orleans is known for fun. A friend of mine always tells me, but the Jazz Festival is more than that. It's fun, it's culture, it's music, it's blacks and whites sitting together and getting along. It's for families, for singles, for straights and gays. Everybody's welcome. It's the greatest party I've ever been to. And this is from a woman who visited from Milwaukee. And that's her observation of the festival in 1979. 10 to 15 years before that, our country was very divided. Our country was segregated. And there were some major pieces of legislation that attempted to promote equality. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is considered one of the literally crowning pieces of legislation achievements of the civil rights movement. And in essence, what it attempted to do was ban segregation in public places, make employment available to all, and not allow discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting practices, and unfortunately here in Louisiana, there were accounts of individuals being given literacy tests in order for them to be eligible to register to vote. So this piece of legislation basically said that you can't do that. And then the Fair Housing Act of 1968, Title 8 specifically of the Civil Rights Act of 68, prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, color, religion, or national origin. And then in 1964, sex was added. So residential segregation was also made not appropriate. But we know for years, New Orleans, Louisiana, has been very diverse, and that there are multiple celebrations of this diversity. There's multiple festivals where the food and the culture and basically this diversity is embraced. So the statement that we hear from a person coming here and enjoying a festival and seeing basically enculturation was delightful, because maybe that was not happening out in Milwaukee. So here's festival. And as we can see, the multiple stages, the cultures, and finally a logo that is embracing of what this is all about. So what I got was a $5,000 fellowship. And I came and I stayed in this beautiful city for almost 8 weeks. And every day I walked through the French Quarter to the archives and saw what had happened the night before. Got to the archives and basically sat every day reading and analyzing these newspaper clippings. And then in the evening going out and just learning about the city and learning about the people and the amazing music. So it truly was phenomenal, and I want to thank Rachel for all her help. She's amazing and so knowledgeable. And I also, Dolores was quite a help to me as well, and it was just really nice to be away from home and have people that you could depend on to give you great recommendations about places to eat and things to see and do, but also questions that I had, because one of the things that's important when I approached this research study is that I had no background on the history. I didn't know who George Wein was. I didn't know who Quint Davis was. I didn't know anything. And so what I want to clarify is that I'm working with clippings that were contracted to be prepared by a press service. And these clippings, literally, some intern somewhere cuts them and sends them. And they were compiled by Allison initially, and then over time, this has become a much more sophisticated process. None of these clippings were digital. They were all from newspapers, and there's a little white sheet that tells me where they're from and the date. And I created a code book, and let me show you what that looks like. This is basically the what I read every day. And what I went through the boxes, took a look at what was available to me, and then framed 2 research questions basically to analyze this content. How did the media present the evolution of the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation? And what public relations strategy and tactics were observed in media coverage of the festival? In total, I looked at 588 news articles spanning 68 through 79, and I had 35 variables that I was coding or looking for in this process. And from there, I did a thematic analysis to understand what exactly rose to the top, if you will, of the topics. So this is an example of a code book, and as I'm reading, I'm looking for article tone. Was it negative? Was it neutral? Was it positive? Did it talk about ticket prices? How much were the tickets? Did it mention New Orleans Foundation? Did it talk about the mission? And so forth. So it took me per article anywhere from about 18 to 20 minutes, because I also measured column inches. I looked at photos. I looked at any type of advertising, just to get a sense of what was big, what was hot at that time. In order to look at strategic public relations, it's very definitely an audience is in mind, and the organization has something it wants to share with that audience. Sometimes it can be a very targeted audience, sometimes it can be a very open-ended audience. But it is strategic, which means we keep that audience in mind when we are generating information. Tactics are things like press releases, planned events, press conferences, guest appearances. And what we try to do in public relations is foster mutually beneficial relationships. So we know this jazz festival is about the local musicians, and things go very nicely until we start bringing musicians in from outside of the area, and that creates conflict. And so looking at the press clippings and how the public relations component handled the conflict, ironically, the foundation typically was the spokesperson for any situation where there was conflict. George Wein and Quint Davis were constantly cited as sources for anything about the festival, even when it was the foundation's turf, if you will. And so for the first 7 years, the foundation really does not have its own identity. It is in the shadows of the festival. And remember, the foundation sponsors the festival. But it felt like, as I was reading through, that there was a lot of stop and starts with the foundation. But because George Wein was the powerful visionary that he was able to stay the course for what he wanted the festival to do. And I just noticed that the foundation did not have many spokespersons. Arthur Davis, who was Quint Davis's father, was a board chair, president, and he was quoted. And then Anna Zimmerman becomes the next source for the foundation and communicates the messages, and typically the ones that dealt with conflict. So now let's get into the year-by-year analysis. And as we can see on the left side, we have a site map of where things were going to be positioned. It's interesting now to see this when we're used to everything digitized and being done on a computer. But yes, folks, this is how it was done back then. And as we know, the attendance at the festival just keeps growing. and to the point where we have to have some marker that identifies our club, if you will, our group. And there you see the flags. And there's one of those delicious soft-shell crabs that I had never had before until I came to festival. So, okay, what are the general findings when we're looking at things? What did we learn? We learned that the reporting of festival focused on its ability to sustain itself. There were horrific financial problems, and weather did not help. And so oftentimes journalists are reporting that the profits are not where they need to be, and how will the next one happen. The identification of event producer, it took 2 years, remember 68 and 69 when it wasn't the foundation's party, but they were trying to find the right person, and Wien comes on board in 1970. Solicitation and payment of performers was actually a conflict area. There were times when African Americans were quoted as not receiving the same compensation as white artists, local versus national. And this is an area that was written about several times. Coordination and management of the event sites. When Congo Square was utilized, it was where the Heritage Fair took place. But still, when you have a large number of people congregating in one area, traffic patterns are disrupted. There's a lot more flow of traffic, and that also deals with people trying to get access to other parts of the community. And when it moved out to the fairgrounds, unfortunately, they were in neighborhoods. And so there was a lot written about the conflict and how people wanted to be treated, and how partygoers didn't always respect people's property. And it took quite some time for that to get worked through. Sponsorship acquisition and promotion, really strong budget problems. Sponsorship acquisition was typically beer. We had Schlitz, we had Miller Lite, and now we have a very different sponsor, but the beer sponsorship was very good for their brand as well, because there was a lot written about festival. And then the generation and evolution of the role of the foundation. As festival became more successful, the media talked more about the foundation's need to be transparent and the foundation's need to be inclusive and equitable. There were also some investigative stories about board members and who was on the board, the composition of the board. And so it was interesting, because that's when we see Anna Zimmerman responding to these issues and doing her best to present a unified message that this is something that they wanted to do. And so over time, we see processes and procedures put into place, and we actually see a call for artists, we see a call for craftspersons, we see a call for those who produce cuisine to make application, and then a group selected that, those individuals. So that turned out to be a very nice way to show the community that they were being heard. Press photos, and these were delightful. Performers and performances. They were mostly local journalists, photojournalists, and photographers that were taking photos. And they loved doing unique shots, basically of performers performing, and they loved to get food. People consuming food, people standing in line for food, and they're just wonderful, warm shots that really make you smile. Weather conditions, there was a lot of rain, people in boots, people in raincoats, people drenched, but still smiling and saying it was a wonderful experience. And then we get into festival attire, and what's really interesting here, a lot of the photographers love to go after the people who are just unique, and some really great attire. They did a lot of photographs about crafts and the diverse art that was being presented and cultural experiences. And then, of course, the beer sponsors, they got a lot of coverage. So definitely something that had meaning. Okay, so in 1969, we are seeing, if you will, the theme that I extracted was, let's build it. But the question was, what are we building? Because they knew they needed local people, and they knew they needed people to attend, and they knew they needed a space. And so during the day, we're at the Heritage Festival, and in the evening, we're going to performances all around New Orleans. And it was a day and evening of complete immersion in these experiences. But promoting tourism is one thing, but coordinating multiple locations with multiple talent, with multiple needs, is not an easy task, and you need a lot of people. At the time, Willis Conover serves as the producer, and the local community needs to be working the festival, working as a, if you will, during the day, the Heritage Festival, and then in the evening, plus attending. And so there's not enough hats for each person to wear. In the 70s, the message is, let's grow it. And the way we have to grow it, basically, is on what we do that is unique. And that is our culture, our music, and very definitely our cuisine. And so musician diversity is what becomes a big topic of discussion in the 1970s. And also here we're seeing a lot of press releases that are announcing who's coming, ticket prices, who's been the vendors for the artifacts of culture, and a little bit more about those who have been chosen to sell food. Miller Brewing does sponsorship, and then the big news is that George Wein is coming, and he is going to be a sponsor. In 1971, the hard reality sets in. We need money to grow. We can't rely on just the local population. We have got to get the message very far out. And so what happens here is we have 100 local musicians performing, but we only had a budget, it was something like $3,000. There was $10,000 the second year, but we don't have the type of money we need to buy ads and to enhance the market that we're going after. So 71 is not really what we would call financially successful, and we're borrowing money in order to keep us going. In 1972, we see really the first public relations full campaign where we are letting the audiences know we're doing a festival, when it is. We're soliciting applicants for both the crafts and the cuisine, and we're beginning to promote the talent that's coming. And we're doing it in advance so that people can plan to come. And then, of course, we have all the hotel packages, et cetera, that are coming along. Basically, the journalists during this time are covering the talent. And we're getting into a little bit more critique about the talents. Did they do a good job? Did they put on a long enough show? Was it of interest? And publicity is beginning to happen. We're seeing a lot more, what I think is really good PR. In 1973, we're really getting into authentic brand building. And what I mean by that is the foundation has a press conference at the Royal Sonesta to announce the kickoff for Jazz Fest. But unfortunately, George Wein and Quint Davis serve as the spokespersons. And so they had an opportunity to own that message. But everyone associates festival with George and Quint, and so therefore that is kind of why that happened. But we have a talent hunt. We're beginning a daily bus service. We are really trying to promote the diversity. So we're seeing a lot of messaging around that particular area. In 1974, we're getting really into the foundation's identity formation. Festival is, at some level, attempting to be better than Mardi Gras, because that's what New Orleans is known at this time. And it's competing with that. And so it's looking for ways to be more unique. It's known as the Come As You Are Party. The logo is evolving, and we've got festival clothing, festival t-shirts, lots of volunteers now. This is becoming a really significant community event. We're at the fairgrounds, and people in the community are figuring out ways to monetize as well with parking, etc. Allison Miner wants a bigger and better event, and she's working PR as well and really trying to stretch it and get more out-of-town media coverage. And we've got the applications for food and crafts positions basically at the track. And the Steamboat Stomp is happening. So there's a lot of really interesting diversity in what's being covered in the media as well as the public relations. 1975 is a very, very big turning point. From 1969 to 1975, pretty much we're in a reactive mode. In 75, we see a huge turn, and that is we're able to pay off our debt. Festival is profitable, and they put $30,000 in the bank, which then, at that time, was big money. We see the fashion line unfolding. People are beginning to buy jazz clothing, the fest clothing, and we still are having the blurred communication with the press conference. We still have the festival spokesfolks speaking up rather than anyone associated with the foundation. But it is considered one of the city's liveliest cultural events, and it's really beginning to get branded. It's getting some more national coverage. We had a reporter from the New York Times write a story, and people from other locations. In 1977, the theme there is share the power and the wealth. And these are when the news stories become much more about equity. So support local and protect your own. And that's because they're bringing in more musicians from out of the area. And press-wise, we're really trying to profile these musicians, and they're getting photos. So there's a big push. Not all of those musicians are local, and there's questions about why local musicians aren't getting recording contracts. People are just looking at the situation and trying to understand why isn't everyone who's local moving into the national arena. And these are legitimate questions because by nature we protect our own. But as we know, not everyone makes it out there for different reasons. We see a $25,000 contribution coming in from the city, and we are now crafting merchants are being juried. But unfortunately, there's claims of discrimination over the process of the selection. And so when I talked earlier about the need for transparency, it's happened multiple times, and as a result of that, protocols have been developed, and there is a more equitable way for anyone who wants to be a part of this process to be a part. And so that information is shared And what I'd like to show you, media coverage. We start out in the early years, but and this is just a short list, there's over 125,000 homes that are being hit, if you will, with the message. Now, I do not have what the numbers are for radio, and I do not know if they bought television at that point in time. This was relatively early, and at that time there were only 3 networks, so TV was very expensive. But this is circulation-wise, we're over 125,000 homes to promote the event. And they're getting all types of news coverage, not just of press releases, things of that nature, but also the performers that are coming and when they're performing. So it's very, very nice that it's growing. And again, this is a really good sign that the public relations effort is working, because you can send all the press releases you want, but the editor has to make the decision to put it in their paper. And so that was happening. The theme in 1978 was an identity of our own. And what we're seeing over time is that Jazz Festival is becoming stronger every year. 10 stages, 250 groups, 200 craftspersons, 40 food vendors, 4 outdoor stages, and the popular gospel tent. It's big. It's growing, it's making money. We also found in the journalistic side that the African American Jazz Fest Coalition felt that there was discrimination. They were denying booth space to local blacks, and they sought control of financial decision making. This was also in alignment with concerns about who was serving on the board of the foundation. And again, transparency was necessary, and the board responded. 2 quotes that I think summarize what the feeling was like at this time is, "This is a true folk-like festival. Everywhere, performers are on exhibit, a definite audience and performers, and there's not much connection between the two." So what the fair organizer, Andy Wallace, was proud of, that there was something there for everyone, and that people could go and listen to one type of music genre, or they could make the rounds and stop in on several. And Rosenthal in the State Times said, "This festival takes different segments of culture and the audience, and that audience becomes the various groups. There are so many cultures that mingle and mix here, and that enables the festival to happen." So again, remember where we were in the 60s and how far we're coming. We're almost into the 80s, and people are appreciating the difference. In 1979, we have a record breaker, and sharing the wealth is something that the journalists are reporting. And this is crazy, but there was a 17-day festival. And I know, can anyone imagine? It was successful, but they opted not to keep that format. I think people were exhausted, and it was really, really large. But basically, it was the greatest number of musicians playing in the most performances, which constitutes the largest musical festival in American history. So yes, right here in New Orleans, he broke the record, and that was in the American press, and Quint Davis was quoted as saying that. Actually, they had to now start limiting the number of sales of tickets. 45,000 was the limit that could be purchased. Remember, we're out at the fairgrounds, but we're running out of space at the fairgrounds. And for safety reasons, that was, of course. They're still honoring, though, that locals get reduced cost, and they still have the Thursday day for everyone local to come. We're still having an interchangeable nature of festival and foundation. Actually, one of the stories had that Jazz Fest gives a grant rather than the foundation. And I do think that part of the problem was that the journalist failed to understand that foundation was, if you will, the owner. And this is in retrospect. I'm certain that as it was happening, that probably wasn't figured out, that just more time needed to be spent letting the reporters know that festival was basically under the auspices of the foundation. So what did we kind of learn from all of this? Well, the little train did make it up the track and has continued despite many obstacles. But basically, we found the festival's brand really was prominent throughout these 9 years, and foundation was coming into its own at the end, and that's because of the positioning, basically, of its public relations. PR and definitely tactics in year 3 become pretty obvious, and then they continue evolving till we actually have a cycle that we can anticipate every year. Issues management, basically the foundation was the voice that addressed anything regarding conflict, regarding race or identity, localism. And reputation management, Ween and Davis, basically, when they were talking about the festival, they were the voices most closely aligned. Today, the festival does have a very clear identity, a very clear voice, and as you'll notice, when you go to festival now, at each stage, there's information that tells you how much is given to the community, who are recipients of the funds, and what other activities they support. So active fellowships, what were the requirements for me to receive this grant is that scholarly use of the collections, new documentation projects that produce primary resource material, and encourage scholarship regionally. So, as a result of this grant, we learned that the foundation needed to tell people more about who they are and what they give back to the community. That it started out with a silence, and that silence, again, I walked on to a festival and didn't see anyone asking me for anything or didn't learn about what they were doing. The second thing that I think is important here, the association with the festival is really never going to change, but the foundation is the power behind the festival, and that's important. The key messaging in those 10 years was very consistent. Preservation of jazz history, the exhibition of unique Louisiana cultures, and providing exposure to the greatest musicians. That we saw happen every single year that I studied, and that was what was communicated in the messaging. The visual messaging through the photos, basically a shot analysis. As I told you earlier, and I don't have to stay with this slide because we did go over it, and funding sources. One of the things that I saw in advertising of the messages that I could look at, it was basically clothing, festival clothing, and food. That were the advertisements that were around any type of messaging. And the beer sponsors contributed a significant amount of underwriting money, but we have to remember that because they were getting cross-promotion, that they were benefiting from every penny that they contributed. So the mission and core values, back in the articles, it's interesting when the foundation incorporated. If you look at the highlighted material, promote, preserve, encourage, and advertise New Orleans jazz, folklore, blues, gospel music, Cajun music, and soul music. These are, if you will, are the founding beliefs, the mission, And this message, as I said, from 1970 forward, has been consistent. So the foundation has been doing what it was founded to do. And when I did the study in 2016, this was the mission statement. And again, encouraging music, culture, and heritage of communities in Louisiana, still the same. And to think that 55 years that an organization has been growing, evolving, going through lots of changes, both in audience and music, that it has stayed true to what its mission was, is very important. So I will now be happy to take any questions that you might have. Did I go the right way? There we go. Thank you.
Hello. Jason, help me. So we do have time for questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Question here, Rachel.
Oh, excellent.
Hello. Was there anything in particular that surprised you the most about that you uncovered? That was a real aha.
I was surprised at the foundation's humbleness. And actually, Quint Davis and George Wein were profound in terms of association. They were the go-to people for the journalist. And sometimes I really felt they shouldn't have been the people responding to the questions, that they were questions for the foundation. But as I said, Anna Zimmerman began to be the spokesperson for the conflict areas.
Did you discover the culture of the foundation? You know what I mean? Or the foundation itself, its personality, or over the years.
I think it was very responsive. That was my read from when something emerged as a question or a conflict. It was handled very professionally, and the result would then be published, right, as a response. And consistently, it was problem solving. It was coming up with a protocol. It was coming up with a way to be transparent. And so, from my perspective, it was handled very, very well. But they were a humble organization in the early years, and sometimes that's just because you don't want to, when you're dealing with money on a yearly basis, you don't want to sometimes talk about being too successful, because you want people to still come, and you want and you want people to continue supporting. Great question, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really great question, the culture.
And I think, based on my experience, that it's a consistent philosophy. The professionalism
That's
and the humbleness.
super kind. All right. Hello, Matthew.
Hello. Just questioning, since George Wein started this, when did the foundation come in, and when did it start making money as an event, as a success that you're finding?
I wear 2 hearing aids.
Oh.
Where I am.
Well, George started the festival. He was brought in by the organization, by the city leaders, and brought George in. When did the foundation come in, And how did, and you're saying and the successes that you speak about, when did those just,
The foundation came in 1970, but there wasn't any type of big announcement or introduction of all the board members. You know, it was just there. And then there is things that come up in the press that are written about the board, that are written about the decisions that are being made by the board. But in those initial years, it's reactive rather than proactive. And I think that was just at the time the way these organizations operated.
who put that organization together? Like George came down and did this and started to do the festival. Who decided, well, it should have a foundation?
Oh, I can't answer that because, Rachel, I think you would have to answer that.
Yeah, I can answer a bit of the historicism of it. So Anne, just to be clear, she's totally coding these 32. So George incorporated the festival as the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation. So it was the fiduciary of the festival. From 1969 to 1970, they carried over the same board members, but they added in Earl Duffy, who was the general manager of the Royal Sonesta. So he actually, we have an oral history with him, and he actually went to George and said, I can't work with these guys. So it was a bit of the old boy network. They are all listed in the 1970 program book as a board of directors. So what you're seeing in the 70s is this growth and diversity of the success of the festival. But then also when times are getting tighter and there's more of a demand of financial accountability is when you start seeing. So Anna Zimmerman was hired, I believe, in 1976. And a lot of that was the early cadence of what eventually became Coindu, which of course now is Congo Square and one of the most sought after spaces at the festival. I do want to just call out, Anne, thank you for this presentation, because when people say to me, I thought that they limited tickets to Jazz Fest, and I knew it happened, but I could never really remember the year. So 1979, 45,000 tickets?
45,000.
So there, and I think that there was another year, but I'm gonna have to wait until you do the 80s. We need another decade. Anybody else, questions? Historical or storytelling otherwise? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious. So you've your scholarly work is obviously focused on the first decade, and you talk about during that decade about George and Quint being the faces of it all. But really, 45, 55 years later, Quint is still very much the face. If someone is getting quoted, last year, this year about anything to do with Jazz Fest or really the foundation, it seems like it's still Quint. I think the foundation's presence is much more known. People are more aware of the charitable causes they contribute to and the other events that they put on. But there's, in my mind, still not another face of the foundation separate from Quint and the festival. So I don't know if this is so much of a question, but I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on even though you focused on the early years, in terms of where we are today.
If I understand your question, you're asking about what will happen when Quint Davis steps down?
Or about the foundation today?
The face of the foundation. Do you think things have changed in terms of the foundation's media presence today?
Well, I haven't. I can tell you that I haven't studied the foundation's presence today, but I can tell you that WWOZ has a very organized look. In its initial, when I looked at it initially, it was a lot of information, but not well planned. The foundation has a crisp website now that's very navigable, that's very readable. The information is usable. And every time I look, they're promoting the different events that they're responsible for, using a lot of electronic communication. They have a Facebook page. So it's very state-of-the-art. That would be my assessment. I haven't studied it, but as I do look at it on a regular basis, and I see a lot of current information and each of the areas that it supports. There's, again, drop-down menus to get further down. And so information now is very available and easy to find. And that's really very, very important for an organization to service its community. You've got to be able to get to the information. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Questions? Oh, another one. Ross, do you have one too? Okay.
As you were beginning the presentation, you touched on sort of the different type of presentation that journalists, female journalists versus male journalists would cover the event. In your findings, how did those coverages differ from the male perspective to the female perspective?
I think what happens, women's orientation to journalism and PR sometimes look at, and I don't want to stereotype, but we do, we might sit in a performance and wonder, why are there no women in that band? We might go and get food and notice all of the women are in the food area, but none of them are in the crafts area. And I'm not saying that men don't see those things as well. It's just from a gender orientation, especially at that time period, that what we look at, how we look at, and what we think about is typically different. In the 60s and 70s, women's place was different than where women's place is today. And so the stories that were reported were very hard news or very feature. And if they were feature stories, they looked at who was performing, their history of their performances, etc. There really weren't a lot of stories that covered this whole idea of having jazz clothing, Jazz Fest clothing. And why wasn't that part of it? Where the clothing was made, who was designing it. I was surprised that there wasn't a little bit more, especially of revenue streams. That festival, in order for it to be able to make the type of excess monies it needed to keep funding, they had to figure out other ways to make money. So recording basically the concerts, the performances, and giving them access to participants or selling them online. That's the beginning. And just looking at different orientations and how might stories also have been written. And I only say that because during that time frame, unfortunately, we saw that journalists were trained in a very specific way, and they were trained to look at things through very specific lenses. And that as more women came into the field, the lens enhanced. And I just would have liked to have seen what other stories might have been there if there was more diversity. And I mean that not just in gender, but I mean that in race, ethnicity as well.
Any other questions? Any observations, Nancy? You showed up in the mid-'70s. Do you have anything to say about this? You can be our closer.
I was there when they poured the sheets down again. Well, I mean, I've been there since I started volunteering in '76, and this past year was my last year, or the year before that, actually. So in all the early years, you know, I worked with 2 fair directors, and then I became the fair director back in '80. But, you know, I just remember in those early years, you know, participating in some board meetings, and it was key people that, you know, signed the notes at the bank to make us happen. And, you know, they were all very dedicated and pretty old school back then. But, and then it grew and grew, and it definitely did change the year of coin due. And it's, I don't know, I've watched a lot. I do believe '79 was the year of Murphy Beach, when it rained on that 3-day. Actually, I don't think we came through with that whole 3 days. No. I think the whole last weekend got canceled.
I'm not exact. I knew
Yeah.
there were days.
Yeah, it was the 17 didn't happen that, I know. You know, we've been through, you know, tents blowing down, tents on the riverfront. Always a great community effort to get everything back up and going, especially Mahaffey Tent Company that's been with us since the beginning. And those tents would blow down. Those guys would stay all night to put up that jazz tent, and those were pole tents there. I remember Cookie lifting the poles in his hands. Same at the river tent down on the river. So, you know, I wasn't here for the beginning, of course, but a lot of those municipal auditorium concerts, which were, you know, quite important in the whole scenario, especially the riverboats. That was just so key in everyone's mind to this day, I think. Memories of staff trying to make that boat and like hanging on, trying to get on when the boat's pulling away. I don't know, I wasn't mainly involved in all the fair, but of course in those days I was on the fringe of everything. I always was kind of on the fringe of everything, but
I do remember reading that Quint Davis's father loaned money for the festival to continue. Signed the note, that's right. And that was a huge risk.
yeah. Oh yeah, it was really a struggle in those early days of making it happen. And when it turned, it was, you know, a small turn, but it was a turn, and it was amazing.
But everyone believed it could be, right? And it is.
But it still remains the best festival in the world, in everyone's hearts, all over the world, everywhere you go.
Mm-hmm.
And we really have to thank, especially that early team, for all that.
Definitely the festival team, past, present, and those who will,
That was tag volunteers.
of course, tag. Yep. So I just want to say this because it's a little interesting to me, is and I was thinking about it, I can't remember if it was Matt who asked the question, but the piece that unites the festival and the foundation is, of course, I was thinking of like Marion Grenup, who was our board president, who really did a lot of work to face the controversy, right? And a lot of that was the belief in, you know, at this point, sort of, tourism is important, but the city is more important, and the people are more important. So at that juncture where the foundation is actually really able to rise, and it has its own board members that weren't just the holdovers from the other board. You know, it was these people that all believed in what could be possible in this very large celebration that was going to benefit our city. And it's that piece that's very essential. And then also, you know, establishing CoinDo as a dedicated black space, which was also very important, that it had its own representation. And it continues today, which I think is really beautiful. So, nobody asked me a question, but I'm putting in my 2 cents. And you have closing remarks? Or should we all go to the bar and get some
I would just like to
snacks?
thank everyone for hanging in there and being supportive. I know that was a little bit of a lengthy presentation, but you asked good questions, and I'm grateful to the foundation.
Sue? Sue wants to know what's next for you.
I'm looking at AEG. I'm interested in the conditions that led to the relationship with AEG and what the stories are that are covered in the media at that time. And so I'm not there yet, but hopefully I'll be through this a couple more months. And I'm so thankful that there's a digital collection. Not really. I really did enjoy my time here. But yes, that's what I would like to understand. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. And I dropped this. I may need you to get this.